And welcome everyone to our talk today from Center for Southeast Asia Studies at UC Berkeley. I'm Sarah Maxim, the Vice Chair of the Center. I would like to turn the presentation over to our moderator, Professor Peter Zinoman, who's a professor of history here at UC Berkeley and one of our CSEAS core faculty. And he will be hosting and moderating the event today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you here this afternoon, or at least it's afternoon here in the Bay Area, to this this book talk today by Leslie Castro-Woodhouse. The talk is entitled Concubines and Crypto-Colonialism, Dara Rasami and the Making of Modern Thailand. It's really a pleasure to introduce Leslie. For one reason, she was one of my first PhD students at Berkeley, and I'm really pleased and delighted with this book that she's produced out of her original PhD dissertation. Let me just say a couple of things about Leslie. She is a local product. She got her BA from Mills College here in the Bay Area, an MA from the group in Asian Studies at UC Berkeley in 2001, and her PhD from the UC Berkeley History Department in 2009. Since graduating, Leslie has taught Asian history around the Bay Area, including at the University of San Francisco and also at UC Berkeley. And she also served for a number of years as the managing editor of the journal Asia Pacific Perspectives out of the University of San Francisco. Over the last several years, Leslie has been publishing. She's published a number of articles and book chapters, articles in places like Trans-Asia Photography Review and Amerasia Journal. You know, her big accomplishment this year is the publication of this book, which we'll be talking about today, Woman Between Two Kingdoms, Dara Rasami and the Making of Modern Thailand. And I just reread the book last night in preparation for introducing her, and I just was delighted by it. I think it's a really just accomplished piece of scholarship, beautifully written, really wonderfully researched, and very rich thematically. It covers the history of interstate relations in mainland Southeast Asia. It covers the history of the culture of Thai diplomacy. It examines important issues in the history of women and gender in Thailand. It looks at the localization of ideas of civilization in Thai history. It's actually an incredibly wide-ranging, broad, and as I said, really rich account of this really interesting historical character and this world, the inner palace, where she spent a good period of her life in Bangkok. So I'm, again, really pleased to be here and to introduce her. I'm gonna listen along with everyone, and then when the talk's over, I will help to field questions. So let me now turn it over to Leslie.
I'm really honored to be speaking at UC Berkeley today, as it's my alma mater. As Peter mentioned, he was my advisor for my PhD. And I want to thank him and Sarah for having me at the center. I want to thank Penny Edwards, who is also a member of my dissertation committee, for helping me get this topic, get this dissertation done in the first place, and also for helping to encourage me in the meantime to keep going and finally get the book out there. So I really appreciate being here, and I'm really honored to speak to you today. So with no further ado, let me get started with my talk. I'm talking about Dara Rasami, but I've titled this Concubines and Crypto-Colonialism, and I will explain in just a moment what I'm talking about there. Okay, hang on. Gotta click things. And of course, the subject of my talk and the book, really, this is one woman's life. It's Dara Rasami. I call her Princess Dara Rasami for reasons I will explain presently. She became one of the consorts of the king of Siam in the late 19th century. The king in question was King Longhorn, who I will be talking about as well. But to help frame this talk and give you all some context to work from, I thought I'd start in a place which everyone's familiar with, right? Everyone has heard of two things. When they've heard about Thailand, they know two things. They know the king and they know that Thailand was never colonized. So I thought I would start with the King and I, which was written, basically we can trace back to one woman, Anna Leon Owens. This is the woman in the photograph on the right of your screen. She wrote a book called The English Governess at the Siamese Court, which after a couple of different iterations was turned into the musical The King and I, and which has become, by virtue of this transformation, has become many people's starting point for what they know, or at least think they know, about Thailand and Thai history. And in many respects, this knowledge is not really factually correct, and yet it is sort of the shared base that I think we all start from. And I think it's a good place to start from also because Anna has a lot to do with the shape of Thai history, especially when it concerns royal women in the palace. Because Anna wrote about those women in the way she did, depicting them all as slaves, as people without any agency within the palace, and also, talking about the king of Siam the way that she did, it kind of rendered this particular topic kind of off limits to scholars who came after her. And now that we're in this particular political moment, I think I can say, those early scholars were white and male and largely coming from European countries. And so they viewed the king of Siam and this world of women, of all his consorts and concubines, as essentially an Orientalist sort of odalisque, right? A harem. It was sort of a symptom of Oriental despotism, and thus not really a form of statecraft that was worthy of study at that moment in history. And so Anna's account has sort of become the beginning and the end of what we thought we knew about Siamese palace women for a long time. And the King and I doesn't really help. Still out there, right? Just floating around. So I started with one woman, with Anna, and I want to move on to another famous woman that I'm sure you're all familiar with, Queen Victoria, England's Queen Victoria. And I asked this question, Queen of Lana, because, well, this is kind of where my story begins. With this idea, a rumor about a young princess named Dara Rasami, and the rumor that Queen Victoria wanted to adopt her and spirit her away to England. And this rumor, when it finally reached Bangkok, caused such great alarm to the King of Siam and his ministers that they immediately made a decision to send an offer of marriage up to Chiang Mai, to the Kingdom of Lan Na, about 300 miles north of Bangkok, to try and ensure the loyalties of Dara's parents, who at that time were the king and queen of a kingdom named Lan Na. It was a sovereign kingdom unto itself. It was sort of a peer kingdom of Siam. They had been allies in the past. And at this particular moment, European colonial powers were pressing in on all sides of Siam. And so this notion that this kingdom just to the north of Siam could potentially fall to the British and become a British colony was of intense concern to the King of Siam. And hence this marital arrangement was made. But at that moment, here, let me show you a map so that you get some idea of the geography of what I'm talking about here. Basically, here is Lan Na in this sort of central landlocked location, adjacent to Burma in the west, Siam sort of to the southeast, Laos, Cambodia, and over here, though it's not labeled, is Vietnam. And notice the boundaries here are very different than the current geopolitical map of mainland Southeast Asia. In fact, Lan Na as a sovereign separate kingdom no longer exists. And the reason I've drawn these little spiral symbols in the centers of these places is to indicate something about the traditional manner in which Southeast Asian nation states sort of saw themselves, which was really more like city-states. And we talk in Southeast Asian studies a lot about the concept of the mandala. drawing from Stanley Tambaya and the Galactic Polity. The Mandala being sort of this, a kingdom with a center from which the power was thought to emanate outward, right, in sort of a spiral fashion, and sort of diminishing and dispersing at the outermost boundaries. But those boundaries were not thought of as being something you drew a line around, right? They just sort of tapered off in the territory that began to belong to the next Mandala state over. And in fact, people living in the interstices between these kingdoms might even pay tribute to both kingdoms or more than two kingdoms, right? There might be multiple sovereignties in play between these Mandala kingdoms. And this was how Southeast Asian states traditionally thought of themselves, not in terms of like static borders that were drawn around their territories, the territories that belonged to them. Their territories were only as strong as the relationships that they formed, the alliances with the rulers of those particular places. So this is kind of the picture of Southeast Asian mainland states in, say, the early 19th century, let's say 1820-ish, that this rapidly began to change. And so this is the relationship that King Chulalongkorn was trying to cement, was between the Lana rulership and the Siamese rulership, to maintain loyalty with the Lana kingdom by bringing their daughter down to Siam as a consort of the king. So who was Dara Rasami anyway? So she was born in 1873. This is a photo of her at about 16 when she had been living in the palace a couple of years. At the time of that adoption rumor was flying around and King Chulalongkorn made the marriage offer to her parents, she was 9 years old. 9 years old. But she wasn't to come down to the palace and start serving as a consort until she came of age, which was 13. So yes, it was a different time. Let me talk also about the crypto-colonialism of the title of my talk. Now, one thing I mentioned about the two things that people know about Thailand is that Thailand was never colonized. So what am I talking about when I talk about crypto-colonialism? In describing how the modern Thai state has come into being and the nature of its practices and its structure, scholars in Thai studies have struggled for a couple of decades with how best to characterize this nation state, given that it was never formally colonized by any other European power, right? The British came into the West and colonized Burma and Malaysia, whereas the French came in to the East, colonizing Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So really pressing right up against Siam, particularly in this era. And yet Siam did not fall to colonialism. No European power took direct control of Siam. And yet the shape of the Siamese state began to look an awful lot like the shape of colonial government structures in those places. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about crypto-colonialism. So it's sort of like colonialism in terms of practices that emulate colonial states in other places, but applied by the elites of one's own state. So essentially, it's sort of like the Siamese elites colonizing their own people. Okay, it's like colonialism flying under the radar in a cryptic way, but coming out in very real modes of practice when it comes to running a government and a state. So I'll talk more about what's entailed in crypto-colonialism as part of this talk, and explain what it has to do with Dara Rasami in particular. Okay, so oops, my map. Oh, there it is. So here's kind of how the landscape changed. As I mentioned, up until about the mid-19th century, it was largely Mandala states in mainland Southeast Asia, whereas by the end of the 19th century, those borders were very firmly established, right? And notice how some parts of the Thai state, like what was up here in Laos, kind of got eroded. They lost some territory, particularly to to Burma. But note that Lan Na has now become part of Thailand by the end of the 19th century. Okay, so let me move into sort of the second part of my talk, which will be talking about the nature of Dara's life in the palace and sort of the contemporary understanding. That will be the third part of my talk. I was talking about Dara's legacy and what happened later on after the end of Chulalongkorn's reign. Okay, but let me begin with Chulalongkorn himself. Now, in referencing Anna Leonowens, Chulalongkorn was actually the son of the king from The King and I. Mongkut was the king in that era, and he had hired Anna Leonowens to be tutor to his children, largely to teach them English, but other topics, other things like history and science from the time. And so Chulalongkorn himself was one of Anna's top students, and when his father died, he succeeded to the throne. Now, anybody who knows their King and I might assume that after King Mongkut's death, that his son, being a good student of Anna's, might just abolish polygamy in the palace altogether and move forward in a completely different way. But this is not the case. While Chulalongkorn was highly aware of all of the European expectations of kings and statecraft in that era, he did not abolish polygamy, royal polygamy. In fact, under his reign, the inner palace, which is to say the living space for all of the royal women, grew to its largest size ever in recorded Thai history of 153 consorts, of which Dara was only one. So Chulalongkorn was very much still operating in both a traditional Siamese mode of statecraft, by which women, as presented by their families, became links to elite families that established political relationships outside the palace that were essential for the Siamese king to maintain his rule. So women played a far more central role to Siamese traditional politics than Anna Leonowens' work would ever reflect. And so this is where I became really interested in pursuing Dara's story, because it also helps illuminate for us this new world of the inner palace and what women's lives were like there. Let me back out just a little bit and show you where I am talking about in terms of the Siamese Palace. Now, if you've been to Bangkok, you've probably been to this place. It's usually the top of the tourist bucket list, right? And it's located in a part of Bangkok called Ratanakosin, and it is technically an island. You see here this waterway, this Klong surrounds it. Here's the Chao Phraya River flowing by on the left. So essentially, this was truly an island when the palace was first established. And this was thought to be a good defensive position, as they were just rebuilding the kingdom, having lost the prior capital to the Burmese in a war 20 years earlier. So the palace is reestablished on this island, which is defensible. But these days, it's hard to tell that it's an island anymore. But it's still there, and lots of people go there. At the same time, what you see when you go into the palace, you will not see the inner palace. This is a really interesting thing. Most tourists go to see the temples and things in the outer palace and kind of stop their tour when they reach the middle palace right here, which is where the Chakri Mahaprasat building stands. And that building also provided kind of like the border between the middle and inner palace. And the inner palace, which I've outlined here in pink, is essentially a city within the city. Okay, it's a walled area within the already walled palace. And this was the area which was where all the consorts and concubines and royal female relatives lived. And this was off limits to the public. It was off limits to most male officials and male royals without express permission. And it was a city essentially run by women, run by its inhabitants, whereby there were officials and administrators, there was a judicial system, there was a jail, and there were guards. And there were also gateways to the outside world. So believe it or not, even though it was a double-walled place and very much off limits to most people, there were actually women running in and out of this space all the time, particularly servants, cooks, running to local markets and to obtain supplies for the women who lived within. So when Chulalongkorn took power in 1868, he began rebuilding parts of the palace for his own use. And this is kind of a custom that most Thai kings followed, that they tore down the old stuff and they built their own new thing. And Chulalongkorn was no exception. This was his own take on a blend, a melange of European and Thai architecture. And basically this building provided both public and private space. It was where Chulalongkorn held audiences, received royal visitors, conferred with his ministers on the lower floors in the front of the building, which we're facing right now. And then the upper floors and the rear of the building actually connected directly into the inner palace and provided family space where Chulalongkorn lived with his favorite wives and their children. He would eat there with them and could spend time with them in those quarters in the same building. Okay, but there was a lot of other residential space within the inner palace. I mean, it was all residential space of varying degrees of fanciness and elegance, some of which was not very elegant at all. Many times, the size of a woman's household and the structure itself was dependent on her social status, the status of her family, and its relationship to the Thai crown. For women who were administrators and other kinds of officials who were not themselves royals, they were accorded living space within the palace. But it was in this sort of row housing here that I have a photo of, and this is a contemporary photo of the quarters after some decades of neglect, that they really weren't maintained for some time, and they look kind of run down here. But you can see there's just a doorway, every several meters. It's just kind of like condo housing, almost like dormitory housing. But women did have separate dwellings with room enough for themselves and a servant or a cook. So Dara enters the palace at the age of 13 in 1886. And she is there until 1910 when King Chulalongkorn passes away. Not long after she enters the palace, well, her first residence is actually in a building adjacent to the Chakri Mahaprasad. And this is very important, as she was spending her days basically in the entourage of Chulalongkorn's favorite queen, who was also his half-sister, Sawapa Pongsi. And proximity was very important here. Proximity was everything. Space and one's nearness to the monarch signaled one's own eliteness and how much merit you had accrued in this life, in a Buddhist sense, that you were allowed to be there. But for Dara in particular, her proximity to the king was crucial in that up until the time she had a child with the king of Siam, any consort, before she had a child with the king, she could still opt to leave. She could opt to leave royal service and leave the palace and go home. And some women did. Women were free to do that from the time of King Mongkut onward. So this was a known quantity. And when Dara first arrived in the palace and started serving in the queen's entourage, she was teased and hassled and given a really hard time because she was clearly an ethnic outsider. I'll go into this a little in greater detail in a little bit, but here you can see she wears her hair up on top of her head. I'm kind of wearing my hair Dara style today. And most Siamese women did not wear their hair this way. She also wore skirts instead of chongkraban trousers, which was the standard dress for Siamese consorts. And so the other women liked to give her a hard time And for a 13-year-old, new to Bangkok, new to the palace, this was not an easy transition. And the king, at a certain point, when King Chulalongkorn got wind of it, he actually sent down an edict to the royal women, directing them to let up on Dara, lest her feelings be permanently hurt and she would have to return home, and it would damage the relationships between the kingdoms. And this was not going to happen on Chulalongkorn's watch. And so after that, things got a little easier. But her proximity to the king was also important because Chulalongkorn really needed to get her pregnant, to put it very simply, so that she could not leave the palace, so that the relationship between the kingdoms would be cemented. And the best way to do that was by having a blood relation in common. And finally, at the age of about 15, Dara did become with child, and she had her first child at 16, and there was much rejoicing. She was very excited and was allowed then to move into her own residence, which I have a photo of here. Now, this residence, oftentimes for elite women, depending on their family, the residence was also a reflection of how wealthy their family was. These residences were not paid for by the king himself. They were paid for by the family. So Dara's family actually was quite wealthy. Their access to teak forests in the north provide them with pretty fabulous wealth for that time. And they provided Dara with lots of money to build a very big house, which you can see below. Apparently, the story is that it began with 2 stories, and then once Dara moved into it, she decided they needed to add a third, because whenever visiting officials from her home kingdom came to Bangkok, she didn't have enough room for them and her entourage and her ladies in waiting. So they added a floor and a roof garden, apparently. But you can see it's a pretty big house, right? But you can tell if you look at this photo on the left, she had nearly a dozen women attending her, all of whom were also from Chiang Mai, from the Kingdom of Lan Na. So her daughter is born in 1889, but unfortunately does not live to see a very long childhood, dies in infancy, like very many children did in the palace. And it was quite a common occurrence. There were many epidemics that swept through this space, which was becoming increasingly crowded during this era. And so Dara herself shares in this suffering and does not ever have another child by King Chulalongkorn. But since she has had a daughter, has had a child, she's there for good. She's essentially stuck there from then on. And so for me, part of the interesting part of Dara's story is how she continues to find meaning and to go on in this life, this very cloistered life within the palace. Now, a big element of Dara's life within the Inner Palace, which surprised me at first, was the fact that throughout the more than 20 years that she lived in the palace, she maintained the ways of dress and hairstyle that were commonplace in her homeland in Lan Na. As I mentioned before, they contrast greatly with those practiced by Siamese women. And she also required that once she had ladies in waiting to attend her, that they also adhere to this standard of dress and hairstyle, that they're all visibly Lan Na women within the palace, even though they continued to be harassed and teased and humiliated by Siamese women for their ethnic difference. In fact, the Thai language accounts describe instances of practical jokes, of people leaving feces in her garden or right outside her residence, of putting caterpillars and crawling worms through the bathroom window on the ground floor, and to continually, sort of behind, snickering hands, describing them as fish paste stinkers, which is a reference to Lan Na foodways, essentially a fermented fish paste that was something really common in Lan Na cuisine. So for Dara to not only not change her style, but just actively maintain it over such a long period, to me indicates a real strength and pride in her Lanna heritage that she was not willing to give up throughout her time in the palace. So here I've put together a diagram to kind of compare and contrast so that you get really clear on what the differences were between Siamese and Lanna style. So whereas the Siamese women cut their hair short, it was almost shaved on the back of the head and right over the ears, and then a little longer on the top, as compared to Lanna women who grew their hair long, but wore it pinned up in a bun on top of the head. Then there was also the issue of what was worn on the top, whereas the Siamese women might wear a breast wrap called a pahom sabai with the pasabai sheng, this thing that goes across. Lanna women usually wore just sort of like a loosely thrown over the shoulder wrap, and a skirt called a pasin, which, as you'll see in some of the photographs, you'll see this distinctive striped pattern on the top, and a hand woven border on the bottom, which is called a tinjok. And this skirt is very different stylistically from the chongkaban trousers worn by Siamese women and men. So these are the big differences that really render Dara and her ladies in waiting visually different from Siamese women just at first sight. You know, when you're looking at a woman from Dara's entourage versus any other queen in the palace. And here I wanted to show you, kind of compare and contrast, photograph of, this is Queen Sawapa on the left, Chulalongkorn's favorite queen. I think he had the most children with Sawapa, and 2 of her sons became king. And you'll notice here's the very lacy Victorian top and the apasa baishiang of a different type here, kind of an adaptation to the Victorian era. A feathered fan, lots of jewelry. She's wearing shoes and stockings, but also the chongkaban, right? As opposed to Dara Rasami style, where she's wearing, you know, the moai hairstyle, you know, a bit more pompadour in this era. She also adopted the lace Victorian blouse, which I see as sort of her own accommodation to the Siamese notion of siwilai and modernity. But the one part of the outfit that does not change is really the pasin. And in this instance, you see the tinjok border, which is probably sewn here with, or embroidered with metallic thread above a Burmese textile, as opposed to a Lanna textile. I'll get into that more later. So I wanted to show you a few more examples of traditional Lanna style. This is from a recent exhibition in Chiang Mai, where a local collector likes to showcase his antique textiles. But what I really like is he really shows clearly the styles adopted by Lanna elite women in the era that would have been Dara's mother, would have worn outfits like this. And you see the pasin here with what's called the head, okay, which goes around the waistband, the body, which is the striped bit, and then the border, which includes this tinjok supplementary weft woven textile. And these are 3 different pieces all sewn together, and they could be changed out should, you know, some part of the skirt be torn or damaged, because the tinjok was so valuable and precious. It's very hard to weave and commands a high price on the market. So these would have been garments that women would have one, you know, commoners would have one of these fancy tinjok bordered skirts, a pasin, and wear something with just the regular textile for daily use. But they would keep this probably their whole lives and hand it down to the next generation. They were precious. So I wanted to show you here this great photo of Dara and her entourage on the steps of the Summer Palace in Bangpa Inn in Ayutthaya, where Chulalongkorn built residences for himself and many of his favorite consorts. And Dara attended with all of her ladies in waiting. But what I like about this photo is you can really see their skirts. You can see the tinjok. and the lovely Luntaya Burmese pattern textile that they're wearing on the bottom. Okay, and notice also that on the right, these three women on the right, four women, these four figures, they are all Siamese officials who are also attending to Dara. Notice their Concubine, right? They're not wearing pasid. This is how we know they're Siamese, and their hair. They're not wearing the muay either. Another element I wanted to note in this photograph is the presence of children, right? You see this little girl up here with her hand on Dara's shoulder. Here's Dara Rasami up here. Dara's holding a little pug dog, and there's a second pug down here being held by one of her ladies. And there are three other children down here. Now, even though Dara's daughter had passed away at only 2.5, she was still intensely interested in being a parent and being a mother, even though she never had another child with Chula Longhorn. And she was very interested in helping out her extended family in Chiang Mai. And it so happened that a couple of her female cousins either passed away or sent their children down to live with Dara as part of her entourage, to be raised by her, as this was also a very high status thing, as you might imagine. But there was a girl and boy, and I'm not entirely sure which in this photo, because there are 2 girls and 2 boys. There was a boy and a girl sent by her cousin's family when her cousin passed away, and this was a frequent pattern in Lana families, that should a woman die, rather than her husband raising their children, they would be sent to her sister, her nearest sister, to be raised. So this is kind of the same pattern taking place here. And Dara raised these kids until they were ready to go off to school. She sent several of them to boarding school in Europe, both in England and France, which she paid for out of her own pocket and also had subsidized by King Chula Longhorn. So even though she was not able to be mother to her own child, she found ways to parent throughout her palace career and even in her retirement after that. So I should mention, as I'm moving into talking about a consort's life in the palace more generally, that there were children everywhere in the palace, in the inner palace, that it was women and children. And children were allowed to remain there until adolescence, at which time basically they were allowed to, they were given a residence outside the palace of their own, and they could kind of spin off their own household and kind of begin their adult life. So visiting the inner palace, you found many households of various types. You had elderly women who were aging female relatives of the previous king, who had never married, because essentially they couldn't find an equal who was high enough status to marry them outside their own brothers. So they would essentially be relegated to a life inside the inner palace, an entire lifetime. But there were also consorts who came from families outside, royal half-sisters of the king who were his consorts, and they established their own households where they had cooks and servants in addition to their entourages, and they were engaged constantly, as you might imagine, in cooking and feeding the people of the palace. There was also a royal kitchen where the king's own meals were prepared. And so consorts took a huge part in all of those activities. But there was also, leisure activities for women within the palace and green spaces outside of their households where they could picnic, spend time in the shade outside their homes, play games, go swimming in various ponds within the palace. I love this photo on the left of some of the Bunag family sisters all around this particular water feature. You see them a lot. So I can speak more. I'm hoping you'll save your questions for me about life in the inner palace for question time, because I can't cover it all here. But I wanted to at least give you a taste of what life there was like. So Let me see, where am I for time? Okay, I'm good. I want to talk now about, I've kind of covered sort of the first 10 years or so of Dara's career in the palace. And as you might imagine, after her daughter passes away, her role as a sort of a political figure within the palace changes a lot. She's not going to have a royal descendant who could possibly become king. And after, I think about 1895, King Chulalongkorn doesn't have any more children. I think royal fertility basically kind of tapers off after that point. And so there are no more children born in the palace from that point onward. But at the same time, there's big political shifts happening within Siam itself. And as I mentioned before, King Chulalongkorn himself was very interested in reshaping Siam into a more modern nation state that aligned with the same kinds of practices as European nation states, but in particular, European colonial states. In fact, right after his coronation in 1868, Chulalongkorn embarked on a tour of several Southeast Asian colonial states, including Dutch Indonesia, Singapore, and he even traveled to India to observe British colonial practices there. And he was not only the first Thai king to travel outside of Siam, but he actually traveled quite a bit outside Siam throughout his royal career. He made several long tours of Europe, visiting the heads of state there, both in the late 1890s and the early 20th century, collecting art, buying antiques. It's really quite incredible. There's a great book on that topic by Maurizio Pileggi called Lords of Things, which describes the incredible luxuriant buying habits of the Thai monarch in this era. But at the same time, politically, Chulalongkorn wanted to reshape Siam from a Mandala state into a more rational, sort of European style nation state with more rationally oriented administrative units and a government to match, right? So a whole new set of administrators and officials, many of whom were actually Europeans who he hired into the role to help with this sort of rebuilding process. And they began naming those new administrative provincial units Monton, which is essentially a Thaification of the word Mandala, but kind of rationalizing it, utilizing it as the new unit of thought around Thai territory. This is a completely new way of thinking about administering a state in Southeast Asia. So I want to move back to this idea of crypto-colonialism, where Chulalongkorn is observing how European colonial states administer their territorial possessions. And he's bringing back many of those practices to Siam and implementing them, not least by hiring actual Europeans to carry them out, right, to help him set it up. But on the other side of this, there was also sort of a set of visual discourses, I want to say, around this crypto-colonial practice and a worldview that evolved amongst the Siamese elites, which they came to call Siwilai. And this is basically a Thaification of the word civilized. And it had the same connotation, right? That in order to be civilized, you needed to reflect all these different aspects of what the Siamese consider to be modern culture, which of course, what we're talking about is European modern culture, right? Becoming a member of this club of European states around the world. And I think the Siamese elites, particularly King Chulalongkorn, really wanted to think of themselves as joining this league along with those heads of state. And I think I love the photographs in this era, and I've got a lot of them to show you, which is, it's a visual feast. But you can really see clearly how Siwilai is manifested visually in these pictures. You can see how Chulalongkorn, who is sitting here in the center in this white top hat, surrounded by his sons, his brothers, his ministers, and a few Europeans in the mix. I believe this photo was taken in Singapore during one of these tours. How they are visually demonstrating their Siwilai through dress, through their poses for the photographs, through the fact that they are being photographed even. This is a great picture of King Chulalongkorn on the eve of seeing his sons off in Britain for schooling. He had almost all of them sent to British private schools. And here you can see he's got about a dozen sons here of various ages in their very Siwilai outfits and top hats. And Chulalongkorn himself became very adept at utilizing this visual language that he'd seen demonstrated by European heads of states in their official photographs. But you'll also see how he's incorporating various European militaristic elements into his dress, particularly the upper jacket here. He's wearing the pith helmet taken directly out of British colonial practice and uniforms, along with Thai Concubine, right? But also socks and shoes because, well, we've got to be Siwilai, as is this whole backdrop, right? But it wasn't limited only to the men. Oh no, the women were also participating in a similar set of visual practices around Siwilai to demonstrate their membership in the modern set, right? And their participation in Siwilai. This is Queen Sawapa, once again, wearing chonkaban, socks, stockings and shoes. But check out her blouse, this fantastic mutton chop sleeve, her tiny little waist cinched into this very lacy structured Victorian blouse, and topped with a sabai xiang across. So sharing a similar language, visual language here in terms of the photographic portraiture as well, right? This could be a woman from in Europe of this era as well. Now, how did Dara figure into this? Because as I discussed, she has adapted parts of her dress to sort of modernize it, to adapt it to sort of the Siwilai understanding of being a modern person and something that accorded with her status as a royal insider. Even as a Lan Na royal, I think she wanted to demonstrate her membership in Siwilai as well. And she begins to show up in Siamese photography in a really interesting way. Photography was another element of Siwilai that the Siamese elites really loved. And not just the men, a lot of women, royal women, became involved in photography within the palace. And this particular photo, as it was taken by a woman who I'll discuss here in greater depth, Erb Banag, another royal consort, who was a favorite of Chulalongkorn in, say, the last 15 years of his reign, and who was also friends with Dara Rasami, and who photographed her on many occasions. Okay, so this photo was by Erb. I love this sort of pastoral, outdoor scene where Dara seems to be, pining for the forests of Lan Na, thinking about where she's come from in the forests of the north. Whereas there are other official portraits of Dara where she is firmly in sort of the Siwilai mode. And in this shot, which I believe is taken in a studio, maybe Francis Chit or one of the other royal photographers, appointed photographers, she's seated in this tableau where she's showcasing this stereograph viewer. At the same time, she's wearing her customary pasin. This here's a Burmese luntaya pattern textile with the teen joke border, but also the lacy Victorian blouse, right? Very similar to what Queen Sawapa was wearing. So very much in the Siwilai mode, yet she is not a Siamese royal, not an insider in that respect, but an outsider. And yet she continues to appear in these photographs which demonstrate her membership in sort of the Siwilai Club, right? This photograph was taken sometime, I think around 1905, when the palace moved out to the Dusit district. Longhorn built himself yet another palace. But he didn't move all of the women out there with him. He only moved his favorites. And Dara was very fortunate to be in that number. But here she poses with, an automobile, which is sort of like the height of Siwilai in that moment, right? But alongside also mostly other Siamese officials on the palace. And this is where I want to shift to talking specifically about the women behind cameras inside the palace. And if you want to know more about them, actually, I wrote an article about this a few years ago called Concubines with Cameras, which you can find online. And this is one of, I think, the most interesting parts of Siamese history that I've been lucky to study. And you can see here, these are all Siamese women. They are royal consorts, every one of them. And these 5 are actually sisters. They are all Bunag sisters from the Bunag family, which have been very closely aligned with the Thai crown for a long time. And it didn't lessen in this era. I think Longhorn had something like a dozen women who were consorts who were from the Bunag, various branches of the Bunag family. But these 5, they were referenced as the Kok O, which is to say this O clique, because all of their names began with the same letter, and they were all sisters. Now, the one that's a photographer who I wanted to talk about is this woman, Herb Bunag, who is here taking a photo of her father, who was at that point a very high minister in Chulalongkorn's government. And she also took a lot of informal and posed photographs within the palace. And there's one series in particular of Dara Rasami that I want to show you because I think it highlights so perfectly how Dara's ethnic difference came to play a different role in the second part of her career in the palace, kind of in her later career. Just when you would have thought that her relevance had fallen by the wayside because the political relationship she embodied with, between Lanna and Siam had basically been cemented, and it was a done deal. And at this point, within the Monton system, Lanna was becoming merely another administrative unit within Siam, especially after Dara's father, the king there, died in 1897. There was no real full successor in his role. There was no king that followed him. Rather, his son, his next successor son, became a co-administrator alongside a Siamese official in Lanna from that time forward. And so gradually, the power devolved fully to Siam by the early 20th century. By 1910, it all belonged to Siam. And so you might ask, well, how would Dara's role then, be relevant anymore? And the answer lies in her ethnic difference and its relationship to this idea of Siwilai and the crypto-colonial process, right? Because just as European colonizers looked at the people in Asian nations as others, the Siamese began to shape their worldview, this worldview of Siwilai, around a similar hierarchy of civilizations, whereby if there has to be somebody at the top, there's got to be a winner. And they were looking at the winners. They were looking to the British and the French, who were at the peak of this sort of civilizational pyramid in their own world. And the Siamese adapted this hierarchy to their own context, whereby the Siamese became the people at the peak of the pyramid. But who was below them and where they ranked had yet to be figured out. This is the era where that figuring out was happening as the Siamese elites moved outward from Bangkok and began to go out into the countryside and encounter the peoples of their own kingdom that they had never had contact with before. So they were going to Lanna. They were also going south and encountering peoples in the Malay Peninsula and to the northeast. And they were gathering information as they went. It was very much like a colonial knowledge gathering endeavor during this era. But Dara provides a really convenient other within the palace for the Siamese to look at. And they become fascinated at this point by her ethnic difference. And they decide that it can play its own role in helping them construct this hierarchy. Because while Dara is definitely not Siamese, neither is she, at the bottom of this pyramid. In fact, her presence there and her eliteness have this effect of kind of raising up the idea of the Lanna people higher in the hierarchy. Okay, so they're just below the Siamese in this pyramid and don't fall much further, but because Dara helps make them intelligible to the Siamese. So what these photographs are really about is showcasing Dara's ethnic difference, something that's been there all along, but suddenly in 1905, when a photography contest happens in the palace, Erb decides it would be really interesting to take photographs of Dara Rasami letting down her long hair for the camera. So that's what's happening in this series of 5 or 6 photographs. That there's this tableau set up outdoors. It's on the lawn in front of Siamese Palace with this dressing table and perfume bottles, mirrors, multiple mirrors, which is really interesting because you can see that the photographer is actually allowing us to see the reflection of Dara's hair in the mirror as she's turned around and see Dara's face reflected multiply as well as part of this process. Then she finally lets it all the way down. It's tremendously long. It's like knee length hair. But you can also see here in this mirror, you can see behind the photographer, and this is the dead giveaway that it's not actually inside a house, right? You can see the outdoors behind them. And yet Dara herself is a willing participant in this process, right? She doesn't have to do this. She's elite enough that she could say no. But it appears that she also was really fascinated by photography and participated in its production with Erb on several occasions that are well documented. But one of the ways, the most important ways that Dara's ethnic difference is ultimately utilized as part of this crypto-colonial process is in the play Sao Krua Fa, which is essentially the Thai version of Madame Butterfly. And this came about after one of Chula Longhorn's long European tours in the early 1900s, where one of the princes, I think Prince Narit, heard a performance of Puccini's Madame Butterfly and decided that he wanted to adapt it for a Thai audience. And when he returned to Thailand, he, looking around for examples of a way to make this story and this idea intelligible to Siamese people, he settled on the idea of transposing the roles. So the American naval officer and the Japanese woman of the original, Madame Butterfly, become, in Sao Krua Fa, they become a Siamese soldier and a Lanna woman. And the Lanna woman is modeled directly on Dara Rasami. In fact, Prince Narit even directly approached her and enlisted her help in choreographing the dances, in arranging the music, and then, of course, emulating her hairstyle and dress for the heroine, the tragic heroine. And this story, not only did it become a smash hit in Bangkok on the stage in 1909 for a paying public, but after that, it became the subject of film and later on television and has been remade and remade and remade. And so this trope of sort of the tragic but beautiful, kind, gentle, guileless Lanna woman and the sort of predatory Bangkok playboy, these tropes live on in Thai culture even today. And I posit that this musical, a lot like The King and I, actually, this musical is why, right? Because these pop culture images continue to circulate that find their origin in Dara Rasami's presence in the palace, which resulted in her promotion. I think I'm running out of time, so I will keep moving on here. But at the very end of her palace career, I mean, they didn't know it was the end, but about a year before King Chulalongkorn died, he finally promoted Dara. Now, up until that time, she had had the same rank as any other consort who had a child with the king, which was Jiaochom Manda. And a lot of other consorts, 35 other consorts held this rank. But a woman's rank could improve based on her performance of her duties within the palace. And this was measured by both other women and the king himself. And so in 1909, the king finally decided to improve her rank and bestowed on her a very high title, this Prarachaya, I should say. Usually it's pronounced Prarachaya. But basically, it's a title in the same league as the other 4 high queens who were all his half sisters. So those women were all of Chakri blood, Chakri family blood. Dara was the sole high queen who was not. So this was a very high promotion, very significant promotion. And ironically, it happened while she was out of town, but that's another story. So you might ask, after Chulalongkorn's death, what happened to royal consorts? And generally, in traditional Thai politics and statecraft, when one king died, his consorts kind of cleared out the place, maybe returned home to their natal families, and ceded the palace to the next king, who brought in his own consorts. But in this case, after Chulalongkorn died, some of the women went back to the old palace where they had lived before and left the new palace at Vimanmek to Rama VI. But the debate had already gotten underway as to whether royal polygamy was a good idea, whether it was still necessary, whether polygamy was a good thing for Thai society, whether it was consistent with Buddhism. And this debate had begun raging in the public newspapers, in the public sphere. And actually, King Rama VI, Chulalongkorn's son Vajiravut, openly decried the practice. And actually, he had vowed that he would not take more than one wife during his reign. But ultimately, due to his inability to produce an heir, he ultimately ended up with 4 wives, by whom he only managed to have one child, and it was a daughter. He was so disappointed. But when he died in 1925, the throne then devolved to his brother, Prajatipok, who only had one wife ever. So this was the moment in which the Thai monarchy finally became monogamous. And it stayed that way for nearly 100 years until, well, about 2 years ago. But I'll talk about that later. You can ask me questions about that. I talk about it in the book. So what happened to Dara Rasami? After King Chulalongkorn's death in 1910, she stuck around Bangkok, actually, for a few more years. But ultimately, in 1915, she returned to her hometown and embarked on a really interesting post-palace career, where I think she picked up something. She picked up on the utility of deploying her ethnic difference in this particular way, especially in the eyes of the Siamese. She saw what value there might be to sort of intentionally exoticizing herself and maybe Lanna culture a little bit. But I think she saw this as the best bet for keeping Lanna culture alive and maintaining it. So when she returned to Chiang Mai, she set herself up as sort of a cultural maven on several fronts. She ran a dance troupe drawn with students drawn from the local population, not just the daughters of elites, but the daughters of commoners who would bring their daughters to her residence. They would train to dance and then in turn become dance teachers of the next generation. She employed an atelier of weavers who continued to weave tinjok and create new pasin and preserve the local patterns. And her style of dress became kind of emblematic of Lanna women of that era and was adopted by them. I wanted to include this great portrait of young women who were teachers actually at the Dara school that was set up following her return to Chiang Mai, because they all adopted, as you can see, the Muay hairstyle, the white blouse, a pasin, even though these are kind of the more daily wear versions without teen joke, right? But on the left, I want to show you how in a contemporary museum, this is how Dara's dress is kind of showcased, right? This has become emblematic of the dress of a Lanna woman of that era, because Dara sets this model, this pattern. And then interestingly, in the 1920s, as the railway finally reached all the way from Bangkok to Chiang Mai, there was the advent of tourism happened in Siam, and Bangkok workers could travel, in their leisure time. You could take an overnight train suddenly to Chiang Mai. This journey, which had taken 6 weeks in the past and required you traveling up the river by boat because there were no roads and there were no railways. Suddenly in the 1920s, Prince Damrong made a grand tour of the north. Then actually King Prajatipok in 1927, I believe, made a tour of Chiang Mai and was received there with great fanfare. And on return, his wife, Queen Rambai Bani, was sporting pasin with teen joke. And it became all the rage amongst Bangkok fashionable ladies. So I wanted to show you this great image. It's one of my favorite photos of, it's Lady Aton Tipia Nipa, I'm not sure, in a fabulous 1920s evening cape, with this feather, like marabou feather trim, but also her pasin with teen joke, and shoes and stockings and gloves and jewelry and her bobbed hair. And so in a way, it sort of comes full circle that this exoticizing of Lanna style results in Bangkok people actually thinking of it, adopting it as a mark of their ability to travel and their experience of kind of consuming Lanna in the north, being able to travel to Chiang Mai as tourists. And her style kind of persists into the present day. Dara's style and the teen joke, the pasin, the pahom sabai with the white blouse, the muay hairstyle, these have become sort of the set of standard Lanna dress features. It is considered now to be Lanna traditional style, even though this tradition is really only about 100 years old, and Dara herself created it. But if you travel to Chiang Mai now, that is not the story people will tell you. They will tell you it's always been there from time immemorial. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up and cede the floor to folks for questions.
So anxious that there might be no questions. I prepared a bunch, but it looks like I'm not going to be able to ask any of them because there are a lot of questions. So let me start with one by Eric White. Eric asks, of the 153 consorts in King Chulalongkorn's court, how many, like Dara Rasami, represented other royal lineages or kingdoms that Siam seek to dominate through crypto-colonialism versus other important but non-royal political, economic, or social actors?
Well, I haven't done a really super detailed study of all of the families represented by the concubines of Dara's era. I mean, I've kind of gotten the general sense, but what I have looked at is over time how the makeup of the Inner Palace shifted with Siam's political alliances. And actually, there were more women from surrounding or neighboring polities, neighboring states like Lanna, or Sultanate kingdoms, or Laos, or Cambodia during Mongkut's reign and earlier than there were during Chulalongkorn's era. And I think that's partly because of sort of the political shakeout, right? That by that time, Burma was colonized by the British, Cambodia and Laos were, falling under French control. And so those connections were kind of diminishing for Siam as well. So I only have a partial answer to that question. And I think it really actually deserves greater scrutiny because a lot of these families, particularly the ones that are still, they still use the Na Ayutthaya surname, that denotes that they are a direct royal descendant. And you still see these people dominating the society pages of Thai magazines and, you know, newspapers. They are very much still present in Thai social life. And thus I know that they are also exercising additional political pull behind the scenes. So but I don't have the specifics on the families, you know, for say, you know, the last 100 years, but maybe for my next book. It's
Um,
really a worthwhile topic.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. The next question, and I'm going to mix the questions up from the long, elaborate ones to the short, punchy ones. Here's a short, punchy one. Why do you think Dara Rasami did not have more children with the king?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I sort of suspect that once she was in, he was kind of done. That once she'd had that first child and she wasn't going anywhere, he just wanted to make sure that that happened. And although it does seem that they were friendly, like it wasn't an antagonistic relationship. In fact, after his death, you know, after her retirement to Chiang Mai, she grew roses, English roses, and she named one. She created her own hybrid and named it Chula Longhorn, this big pink rose. And that to me hints that there was at least a friendship there, that they did have regard for each other, but that, you know, frankly, he had several other consorts. I mean, Sawapa and Queen Sawangwatana were mother to, I think, 7 or 8 of his children each that survived. And so he really had his hands full with a lot of other consorts and children. And I think that that was his true focus in terms of his family. And so it was, I'm sure it was difficult for Dara, and it makes me think about what those long sort of in between years must have been like for her.
Okay, here's a question from Michael Hirschfeld. He asks, Chula Longhorn adopted Western dress, but the Thai costume in which he is portrayed often seems to have Khmer or Khmer elements, thereby absorbing the ethnic other. This dual portrayal of monarchy is very common in crypto-colonial polities. Is there any evidence of similar doubling, in quotation marks, Western dress for some occasions, intentionally exotic, but not necessarily Siamese dress for other occasions? Or was this a privilege reserved for the monarch?
I would say, yes, there was an interesting sort of variant practice. And also thank you for coming to my talk, Dr. Hertzfeld, because crypto-colonialism is his idea and I am using it. So thank you for being here. But I have to address the Khmer elements of Siamese royal dress, because truly in each era, the Siamese always looked to sort of who is the regional winner as the source of their notion, the pattern of power that they wanted to emulate. I mean, they paid tribute to the Chinese emperor for hundreds of years, but they also modeled, particularly the early Thai, like Chakri dynasty, were looking directly to the Khmer royal customs as sort of the template for their own royal dress and practice, because they saw Angkor, ancient Angkor, as sort of like also a kingdom to emulate. And so that's kind of the source of those elements in Siamese royal dress that became Siamese traditional, right? But in Chulalongkorn's era in particular, there is some very interesting practice of what the British would call fancy dress, or like costume parties. where there are photographs of some of these, and Dara participated in some even back in Lan Na, which I find really interesting. So this was considered, something that elite people did, which was to assume the dress of other cultures that you could, right? These are the people who are at a level of privilege where they have this view of all kinds of others, and they are allowed in this moment to kind of pick and choose and put on that identity for an evening and take it off again because they can. But I should mention also one really interesting thing about Chulalongkorn and his own fascination with photography is he liked to go in disguise out into the countryside to shoot photographs of the common people. And I think part of his goal also was that he wanted to sort of get to know what real people were thinking and talking about without them deferring to him as this royal figure. Because if they knew that he was a king, they would be on the ground prostrate, just face down. There would be no interaction. It would be over. So he intentionally put on the persona of a maybe a wealthy Thai male to go out into the countryside and shoot photographs and hang out and take, picnic and do these things. So it's a very interesting example of how Chula in particular is able to try on and take off these different personas and doubling, both as sort of a European modern and a Siamese modern at the same time.
The next question is from Catherine Bowie. She asks, do you have any sense of who stayed in Dara's residence in Bangkok? Given that adult men were not allowed in the inner palace, could men have been her guests?
Actually, from what I've read, male officials could actually stay in her residence. And from what I understand, her male relatives, half brothers, would come down from Chiang Mai, twice a year on average to pay tribute to the King of Siam and would stay in her residence. But you had to have permission for this to happen. And they were very carefully supervised. No male went unaccompanied anywhere in the inner palace. So it was highly circumscribed. And I would imagine that once they were there, they probably didn't leave her residence very much, that they probably left to go to the Chaki Mahaprasad and come back and maybe spend some time outside the palace. But otherwise, they would have been pretty much confined to her residence while they were there. But it did happen. So there were men inside the palace, but and workmen were allowed, doctors were allowed, but vendors were allowed, but it had to be supervised. There was a chaperone required for lower level workmen and people like that, and then permission even for like royal pages. So there were young males, pages running back and forth, but always supervised and always accompanied.
This question is from Marjorie Muecki. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. She asks, the Dara Rasami Museum in Chiang Mai portrays Dara's insisting on her ethnic difference from the Siamese early on in her consortship as her strategy for changing Siamese denigrating opinion of the Lana people so as to see the Lana people as peers. This seems a bit different from your interpretation. Is it? Why do you see it differently?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I think I hesitate to go quite that far because I just don't feel like I have the evidence to say it. But I do have the evidence of her actions and her behavior, which indicate to me that she felt strongly enough about it that she dealt with personal, I mean, it entailed personal sacrifice on her part to maintain this level of dress. And there was one other Lan Na woman consort in the palace at the same time who had started a couple of years before Dara, even had a child with King Chulalongkorn. But she had started out in the entourage of a Siamese consort and was required during that service to dress in Siamese fashion. But even after she got her own household and was no longer required to do it, she did. She continued wearing Siamese style hairstyle and clothing. And I suspect it's because being the solo Lanna woman in the palace and taking all of that crap would just not have been bearable. And so she assimilated this other consort. Whereas Dara, I really strongly suspect that she was encouraged by her family to maintain her Lanna style before she ever left Lanna, before she came down to Bangkok, that it was a point of pride, that the Lanna leadership was exchanging a certain level of autonomy for this status, but they did insist on the status. So I don't know if that's entirely answering that question, but I don't know that I have access to the same evidence that perhaps the people at the Dara Museum have seen. I know they might have seen more of the stuff that the family owns, but also I'm not sure how much of that narrative has evolved in the last 80 years, truly, because her legend has a very interesting role in local Lanna identity. And so I can't be sure also that that narrative hasn't been constructed in the meantime.
We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, and we've got a bunch of questions, so I'm just going to pick and choose. This is from Andrew.
Spin the wheel.
This is from Andrew Johnson. He says, "Thank you so much for this. It was really fascinating." And he actually has 2 questions. One is, I wanted to ask a bit about the concept Orientalism. Is that a fitting frame for Siamese perceptions of or appropriations of Lanna cultural elements? Is it useful to think about Siam-Lanna relations in a kind of Orientalist frame or not? That's the first question. And the second question is, I wonder about this era and its impact upon present-day Lanna regionalism, both as a kind of fuel for Lanna regional pride, as well as a history that links it deeply to Bangkok.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 actually quite kind of different questions.
Yeah. Well, I think I can answer the second one a little better than the first, but in terms of thinking about Orientalism and Dara, I think where I felt that applied the best, was to Dara's sort of self-Orientalism, if you will, like in exoticizing intentionally her ethnic difference in a bid to sort of gain more status for the Lanna people, for Lanna identity, in an era when it was very much at risk of just being, if not erased, at least kind of papered over with Siamese identity. And I think that Orientalism might apply in that, we're talking about, a Siamese view, Orientalizing essentially like the Lanna people. But Dara is this interesting in-between figure, right? Where she both is subject to the gaze, but also takes things back to Chiang Mai and responds to the gaze from there. But I think actually I can answer the second question better because I've been working with a couple of fellow scholars who are working on contemporary political movements and identity in Northern Thailand. And what we feel like we're finding is that because of the way Dara built this notion of Lanna cultural identity and tradition that is somehow full under the umbrella of the Siamese royalty. It's very royalist aligned in Chiang Mai today. And I mean, the whole Chiang Mai royal family now, the Na Chiang Mais are aligned with and very much pro-monarchy. They are not red shirts, right? And yet there's not a real impulse towards separatism amongst Lanna people. There's not this notion that, we want Lanna back, give us our land back. In fact, it seems more like the cultural, the availability of all of these cultural elements and people's ability to utilize them, participate in them on a daily basis seems to kind of diffuse that on a certain level, that they feel like they're allowed to continue practicing their culture. And so, and they have a seat at the table politically. So what's really the point of agitating for greater self-determination. Like they feel like they've got enough control. But I think it goes back to this interesting sort of official cultural nationhood that Dara helps to create with her, the dress and dance and musical practices. That it's like a cultural difference that can coexist with a Siamese state, if that makes any sense.
Okay, it's 5:30. We've come to the end of our time, but I want to really thank everyone, all 98 of you, for coming out to this talk today. But also really thank Leslie for giving a great presentation and for writing a really terrific book. And I encourage everyone to go out and read it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for attending my talk. Thank you, Sarah and Peter and the Center for hosting me. And I look forward to seeing you all out there again somewhere.
In person, one of these days.
Hopefully.
Thanks,
In a
Leslie.
post-pandemic world. You're welcome. Thank you. Good night.